Welcome to the Gone Phishing webinar. I'm Chris Piggott, CEO of Synextra, and I'm joined today by DCI Chris Maddocks. Chris, do you want to give us a bit of a background, tell us a bit about your history?
Yeah, certainly. DCI Chris Maddocks from the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit. So I'll just explain what that actually is, Chris, if that's all right.
Yeah, sounds
I'm
good.
sure most of the people watching probably have never heard of that because they're good law-abiding people. But the Northwest ROCU, Northwest Regional Organised Crime, is a collaboration between the 6 Northwest forces, and we look at the sort of the highest harm threats, the things that are most bothering our communities, and look to respond to those.
Yep. And how much does cyber dominate those kind of concerns and risks?
Yeah, it's quite a big issue for the Northwest community. So I'm in charge of economic and cybercrime. For cybercrime, I've got a number of functions that we look at. One of those functions is investigate cybercrime. So we look at things like ransomware. We will look at some high-level attacks on businesses and organisations. Then we've also got people that will go out and try and raise awareness. And that's probably the reason why I want to be here today, really, because it's really important messages that hopefully we'll go through today to raise awareness of how people can keep themselves safe from cybercrime, because we're not going to rest our way out of cybercrime. We've got over half of all crime in the country is either a fraud or a cybercrime.
Wow, I didn't realise it was so high.
It's really high, and the resource doesn't meet the demand. So what we need to do, and thank you for pulling this together, Chris, is be able to educate people to keep themselves safe, because a lot of the things that we see can be prevented, unfortunately. And I'll just give a very brief example about that, if that's okay. Yeah. So one of the key areas of work I'm really focused around is how to protect businesses, because protecting businesses protects the livelihoods of our communities, protects the jobs of people in our communities, and it protects the economic sustainability of the communities. Protecting them is really important to me. I went down to Microsoft not so long ago, and they were sort of talking around the take-up of two-factor authentication on Microsoft 365. I was really shocked to see that only less than a quarter had taken up two-factor authentication. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about two-factor authentication as we go through this, but just as an introductory topic, it's really important, isn't it? And I'm sure we'll touch on that.
It is, and it's shocking to see how many businesses we actually speak to where it's still not even turned on. I think what's good now is actually on Microsoft part, I think they've actually started to enforce some of that. So you don't get an option anymore. You can go and turn it off in the back end if you really want to, but it's on by default, which is good. So looking towards 2023, what do you think are the sort of top trending cybersecurity risks for businesses?
Unfortunately, we keep seeing ransomware attacks probably happening right now, right across the Northwest and beyond. Unfortunately, it's almost a daily, weekly occurrence for businesses. A number of attack vectors or ways into business to be able to sort of get those in. And I suppose we'll go through some of the ways that people can keep themselves safe from those, or keep their businesses safe and secure with those as we go through. But ransomware for me is one of the key threats.
And when you say ransomware, what's the typical sort of attack vector? Is it ransomware as a service, phishing? I'm guessing that most of those originate in phishing, do they?
Yeah, that's what we tend to see. Some of them we probably don't understand how they get in, if I'm dead honest with you. And they range in businesses, because I'm sure there's people perhaps watching this podcast who might have a butcher's or a baker's or whatever it might be, those sorts of high street businesses that are relatively small and might have a small IT infrastructure. But we see those, and we see that sadly come through as well, and it cripples them. I remember going out to a pub when I first came into cybercrime, and it ruined their business for a while, because all their orders, all their menus, all their things had gone because they didn't have a backup regime, they didn't have the right security measures in place. It was a real shame for them.
We just have such a high dependency on technology. So it's, like you say, it's your Just Eat, your Deliveroo, your tills, all your financial data, your accounts, everything is probably stored on that EPOS system. That's kind of probably one of the things that isn't particularly maintained that well, because it's just a till. Well, does it really need patching? Well, yeah, it probably does. And then before you know it, you're exposed to some sort of attack vector, and that's it. You become crippled without backups. And people probably don't realise in that type of organisation actually where the data is being stored.
That's a really good point around sort of storage of data, and I think it's very easy, isn't it, to look forward in a business and focus around the bits that will bring you more revenue and expand the business in that way. But for me, this is around securing what you've already got, and really building on where you are now, so you can build the space to take forward.
Yeah, a lot of like really good foundational sort of tips and strategies, I guess, to sort of build that IT security foundation in your organization. So in terms of, you mentioned ransomware, what other sort of trending topics are you seeing come through for now we're into 2023 and perhaps beyond?
So one of the key areas that we see on a daily and again weekly basis is email, Facebook compromises. So be that via email or whatever it might be. And it sort of affects businesses as well as individuals. That if I'm selling on Instagram or using Instagram as one of my ways to be able to sell my products, we've seen that happen before, that the things have been taken over. Again, I suppose we're probably almost getting into that rhythm here around things that you can do to protect yourselves. But all those sort of key social media platforms, I know we've already touched on it, haven't we? But they've all got that 2FA, haven't they? Yeah,
and it's interesting because actually, as a consumer of social media products, we associate with consumer behavior. Driving, we're connecting with family, we're viewing photos, but actually, there's plenty of e-commerce businesses doing B2C and that like direct to consumer stuff, where actually that is their key revenue channel. So actually, if their Instagram account gets compromised, that could be hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of revenue a week that goes into vapor. We don't think about it because actually, for us as a business, okay, we post some stuff, but we're not really using Facebook and Instagram. But actually, that just points out the whole two-factor. Actually it applies to a lot of technology, not just your business applications.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose what we're probably all guilty of is because we use password managers now, and you look at your phone, don't you, and it goes straight into your Facebook or whatever else it might be, that we forget there's a password that sits behind that. It's not our face that gets beamed up to Facebook, is it? It's our face that goes into the password manager and then utilises the password that we might have inputted several years ago. And how healthy is our sort of password recycling, and has there been a compromise on that password?
Yeah, no, definitely. One thing that kind of plays on my mind at the moment is kind of a bit of a skills gap in cybersecurity. Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, we do see it, both sort of internally and sort of going externally. So one of the things we've probably not really spoken around yet is one of the other areas of business that I look at is I've got the Cyber Security Centre in the Northwest. Is a collaboration between Manchester Digital, a private company, and the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit, and it's a not-for-profit business. When I first joined police, I used to arrest people, and probably not very experienced about running a business, but fortunately we've got some really good people that sit on our guidance council to support us in being able to build that business. And what the business does is we offer cybersecurity training, we offer vulnerability assessments to the people in the Northwest, to businesses in the Northwest.
And how did that business come about?
I think nationally, the government has sort of realised that there's probably only a small offer for small, medium enterprises, unfortunately, in relation to cybersecurity. And one of the things that we've been really fortunate to be able to do is we've been able to offer free training throughout Manchester, and we're hoping to be able to offer that out to other areas of the Northwest as well through some funding. So far, what we've done with Manchester is we've taken some money that's been seized from criminals, so all that bad money to good, and then we've used that then to be able to fund cybersecurity training to needing businesses in the Northwest. We're still going through the evaluation stage for what that looked like, but from all our initial data that we've got, I'm really pleased to say that all those that have had that training, none of them that I know about have been victim of a cybercrime, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's interesting that taking the proceeds of crime and turning it into cybersecurity training is quite cool, because I saw the funded training on the website and I wondered how do I actually fund that? What's the scheme that does it? Turns out someone else is paying for it and it's the bad guys. Something that we sort of say when we talk to customers is actually there's no single piece of software that can defend against every single attack vector. Actually, user training is a critical component, and actually it has to be interesting, and it's something that you have to keep on top of and do regularly. Obviously, only a small business, we've got things like when you get onboarded, you have to do an IT security questionnaire, and we do some training that I think NCSC provide for free. But yeah, there's lots of businesses that have a lot more staff that need that. And you're right, I think the Northwest is underrepresented when it comes to like really useful IT security and cyber training. So it's interesting to see.
So we were talking about skills, weren't we, before
Yes,
we went into that. So the reason why I talk about the Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre in that sort of way when we talk about skills is because we use students to deliver service under the watchful eye of an experienced cybersecurity consultant, and that's what makes it affordable for us, or for the people in the Northwest. And that's really important, because what we often see coming out of university is individuals who've got the computer science degree, cybersecurity degree, but then sometimes they're not employable because they don't have the certifications that go alongside it, or they don't have experience. I'm really proud of the students who have graduated at the other end of our the time with us, where they're getting some really good jobs at various organisations. They've done really, really well. We support the talent pipeline to go forward.
We've done a lot with like graduates and trainees, and I'm a massive fan of taking people on with like the right attitude and maybe like the beginning sort of the basic skills, and then just developing them over time. And I think that for us has paid massive dividends, because you can mold people to be exactly what you need them to be for the role that they sit in. And yeah, that's interesting, because I hadn't thought about that in terms of, effectively a not-for-profit entity that helps people transition into full-time work, and then kind of those people, I suppose, get put to work and learn on the job by helping Northwest businesses with improving their cybersecurity through training. And what other types of services do you offer as a sort of not-for-profit?
Training's the most service that we offer, and that's sort of the biggest take-up. We'll do a website vulnerability assessment for a business. We'll do a network vulnerability assessment, and one of the things that we have questions around is around phishing. So what we'll often do is we'll deploy a phishing campaign, obviously legitimately and with people's consent, into an organisation, and then we'll train the staff, and then we'll redeploy the phishing campaign in, and hopefully, touch wood, if the training's any good, which it is,
I'm sure it is.
Obviously the rates drop. You see fewer people clicking on links and things because they're more aware of things than they did prior.
It is definitely that, because it's just people don't think that thing that looks like a OneDrive login actually isn't OneDrive, it's a phishing site. And that person that sent you something that, like, we had an example recently, a restaurant sent a customer a tender document, and that restaurant would never tender for something because I think it was a smaller business. And the customer went to open the link. Oh, it's a login page for Microsoft, but it's not really a login page for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to get distracted by the sender when their account's been compromised, and actually it's not them, it's illegitimate. Training's a massive component of that. As we mentioned, phishing. Mm-hmm. And what would you say are the different sort of attack vectors in phishing? What things have you seen in the field in terms of types of phishing emails and how they compromise businesses?
There's a couple of painful stories for people, really, that I can probably recount in sort of vague terms. Yeah. And before we talk about phishing, I'll probably talk about sort of email compromise to start off with, because it could have happened through phishing. I suppose we're really unsure. So it was probably one of the first fraud cases that I became involved in. And this particular case was an individual who was about to purchase £1 million house cash and was about to transfer this £1 million to the solicitor. And of course, they press send on their £1 million, and then the solicitor rings them back and says, well, we've not got that yet.
Oh my God.
And you can probably see where this is going already. And unfortunately, what had happened was the email account had been compromised, which led to some rules being set up. So every legitimate email that went into the email inbox from the solicitor actually went into a separate folder. Whoever had compromised it then had created a spoofed email, so a fake email essentially, and then changed the bank details obviously on it so convincingly and I suppose sophisticatedly that unfortunately the money was lost. And you can imagine the hurt that would have been, being in the chain, no doubt, of a property, but also, will I ever see that £1 million again from that house? Luckily for that particular case, the bank refunded that £1 million. Wow. Of course, probably the first thing you're thinking in your mind there is, well, surely you can trace the money. Of course, you can trace money, you can move along the chain, but what tends to happen very quickly is they very quickly move to mule accounts, and all of a sudden they'll get dispersed between several bank accounts, and it's difficult to trace.
And is that because it crosses international boundaries?
It can at times, yeah. And again, that can be quite tricky. Certain countries are less cooperative than others.
Yeah. And do you see much in terms of like the proceeds of crime being moved into cryptocurrencies to move them around more conveniently?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. I read something just last night that came from Chainalysis around the movement of monies through crypto, and it certainly is an increase, and it's into the billions of dollars according to their assessment. We are getting better from a law enforcement point of view at tracking it, at being able to realise it, at being able to understand where it's going wrong. So one of the teams that I've got in my cyber team is a dark web investigation team. So what they will look at is data that comes off the dark web from the National Crime Agency, and they'll look at things like dark web marketplace takedowns, that sort of data that's been extricated from the FBI or whatever international law enforcement agency has been involved. And we'll have a good look at what everyone's been doing on that dark web. And obviously they very much operate in the crypto space there, don't they?
So then you're starting to look at like wallets and anyone that's involved, like related parties and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You mentioned obviously the email compromise. I've seen sort of similar things as well. Have you come across much that's revolved around the use of the Exchange web shell or web proxy exploits?
No.
Okay.
I haven't anyway.
Okay.
My team might have done.
We've seen that's been quite prolific. Sort of some of the stuff that we've seen is very similar. So you get the Microsoft Exchange server gets compromised through a really like a high severity vulnerability, and that enables an attacker to remotely control the Exchange server, and they can do stuff like create rules, put forwards on, live effectively inside someone's mailbox, and reply to and spoof replies externally to internal senders or external senders, portraying to be that organization.
Wow.
So they can get involved they can reply to like old email chains and resurface them and use those chains to appear genuine, but they actually set a different from address and have it go to a spoof mailbox. We've seen a few instances of that with people that have come to us with issues, and I just wonder whether you'd come across that previously. But
we've not identified it, in fairness. So how would someone protect themselves from that?
So I think the first thing is if people are still on Exchange, they just shouldn't be on it anymore because Office 365 is here. But I suppose there's some organizations that have to keep Exchange for some reason. And it's just applying the most recent set of patches. And then if you're worried you've been compromised, there's various kits online that you can check to see whether you have been compromised with those proxy exploits. What other types of phishing have you identified?
So I'm sure everybody gets loads of phishing emails every day. I do. I'm sure everybody does. And I don't know about you. When I've spoken to groups of people before, I've often said, has anyone been victim of a cybercrime? And if somebody doesn't put their hand up, I'll sort of pick on them a little bit and say, I bet you've had a phishing email in your email box. And then they soon put their hand up. And so does everybody else around them because they don't want to be singled out either. But I think there's some real key messages to get across with phishing. And what we probably don't understand or don't appreciate so much is what goes on behind the scenes with phishing. So we get these annoying emails, don't we, into our email boxes on probably a daily basis. And my message will be to report phishing. And you can report it from the bar underneath here, the address that's underneath this screen, because that's important. That will then go to the National Crime Agency and then the NCSC, and they'll start to block those emails coming in from which way they might be coming in. It allows them to start doing work around them, because you probably won't be the first receiver of that email, because I think the clue's in the name with phishing, isn't it? You throw a rod, cast a net, and off it goes, and then you see what comes back in. So
one thing, I watch quite a lot of YouTube. We've got a YouTube channel, just shout out YouTube channel. There's a few very popular YouTubers, and one of them's called Mark Robe, and he does these glitter bombs. And he, in his final season, penultimate season, comes across someone who's been targeted by an offshore contact center, and they do stuff like they remote onto your computer, and they go and manipulate your online banking page by just like going in and editing the DevTools settings to like change your bank balance and like make it seem like you've paid them some money, or that you've got more money than you should have because they've accidentally transferred some to you, and then they make you send them, the amount that they've transferred you supposedly back.
Yeah, we have seen quite a lot of individuals who've had phone calls reporting to be from the bank saying, please install this software because it's really important, and some people have done so, and obviously you can imagine what sort of software that is. It's sort of remote access software, so people can access and drive your computer from elsewhere, and you might be legitimately logging into your bank details to check the information you've just received on that same device, and obviously someone else can see all that and then clear out people's bank accounts, which is absolutely soul destroying. And you can only imagine what sort of people might be targeted there, and unfortunately it's the people that probably need all our help more than others, isn't it? Often it's our most vulnerable in our society that we want to be taking care of the most that happens to.
I see a lot of stats in the sort of media around like the last sort of 12 months that it looks like we're turning the tide slightly on ransomware, but I wonder whether from your perspective it feels like that. Does it still feel like ransomware is as prolific as it was maybe 3 years ago? Or has detection and prevention and training progressed to the point where we're seeing a bit less than we used to? Or does it feel very much like actually it's still, I suppose the issue in your shoes is that you're still going to get people coming to you, but maybe is the volume slightly less, or is it still what it used to be?
I think there's probably quite a few parts to unpick through that. Yeah. So I suppose in terms of volume, from a law enforcement point of view, we'll probably never know the true volume because I absolutely get, and I understand it from a business point of view. Does a business want to be coming to law enforcement for a criminal justice outcome? And how, from a business point of view, will they see law enforcement supporting their business? And I get that. I suppose my caveat to that back to those businesses that might be watching this is, well, try us out, and if we can help you, we will. So certainly around ransomware, we work with Interpol, we work with the National Cyber Security Centre, and we've got decryption keys for some of these ransomwares. So we might be able to solve some of the problems for you before they become a problem. So if you're hit by ransomware on a Monday, we could have you up and running by a Tuesday if you try us. So that's probably the first message. In terms of volumes, from the latest data I've seen, they've stayed pretty static year on year, the number reported to law enforcement. But the interesting thing that's come out, which is something I read yesterday, is the payments have decreased quite significantly to these ransomware attackers, which I think is really interesting, that because why 2 years ago were more people paying ransom and fewer people in the last year have paid ransom? The
assumption would be on my part that people are more well educated, and actually there's probably more insurers now refusing to pay out, because that seems to be the general consensus now, is that don't pay unless, well, just don't pay. But sometimes I suppose there's plenty of businesses that don't have an option. And you hear some news stories of organisations in the States, and they never publicly declare whether they paid the ransom or not. I think one maybe did, maybe an oil pipeline. And you can quickly see the justification where the ransom is, I don't know what it was, but if it was $15 million and they trade $6 million worth of oil a day, you can quickly see that actually that ransom makes a lot of sense to them to it. But the problem is, of course, you pay the ransom, you'll be a target again because they know that you can pay.
So the law enforcement advice is always not to pay, because where that money goes is to no doubt further fund further ransomware, if not organised crime or whatever else, but nothing good will come of that money, will it, that payment? Which is a really important message to pass out. And I suppose we've seen, haven't we, in the news recently, we've had those sanctioned individuals that are linked to ransomware. Again, that'll be an awkward conversation to be having with your bank and whatnot, to say that, oh, actually I've paid a sanctioned individual. Certainly be getting a knocking on the door from some of my friends as well.
How do people go about getting support from law enforcement, and what size businesses does that sort of tend to start at, and how do they raise the flag or raise the alarm, so to speak?
It's really easy for businesses to raise the alarm to law enforcement. There's a 24-hour reporting line where you go to Action Fraud, which is part of the City of London Police. Perhaps we'll put that in the show notes underneath the screen here, definitely, so people can see it and learn how to do that. And what will happen with that information then? You talk about, if you're a victim of ransomware, they'll help you 24 hours a day. They'll talk you through the first steps and what that means. What it will often mean is probably sitting tight to the morning if it's in the middle of the night and that sort of thing. But they'll give you some initial advice, and it's all registered. The National Crime Agency then will have a look at your case and decide who's the best resource in the country to deal with that. So if it's critical national infrastructure, then it obviously needs a high level response. Or if it's a local pub, you need a different level of response, perhaps a more local response. And they'll arrange for that to happen, and they'll navigate that for you. So you're getting that quicker support. It works. I've had it received some cases, and it's worked really well.
I was reading the website for the NWCRC.
The Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre.
That's it, yes. And I actually came across the links to Action Fraud. I've heard of it, but I wasn't aware that it also dealt with cybercrime as well.
No, it's an important service, because early doors, we can help and put some law enforcement tactics in place to be able to understand the threat. And I remember going to my first ransomware attack that I dealt with, and I sat down with the business owner. I sat most of the day in their boardroom. Some of it was around how to support their recovery, liaising with agencies to see if we had a decryption key. All these things are really important for businesses to try and get them up and run as quickly as possible, because we're not blind to the risk to the business of stopping things. We're not blind that, of course, it's always a business decision about how things move forward. We want to be able to get that business back up and run as quickly as possible.
I suppose now we move on to the what can people do to sort of protect themselves. If we start with some ransomware, what are sort of the key steps businesses can do to protect themselves from ransomware?
For businesses, I would suggest staff training, if I'm dead honest with you, will probably be the first bit. So the incident I just described to you, that very first case, when they traced that back, it was an individual who, again, clicked on a link they shouldn't have clicked on. And
shocker.
Who'd have thought? And that was solely the thing that brought that business down for such a long time. Fortunately, I'm in a position to be able to offer that as a service to the people of the Northwest. So the Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre will be able to guide you through that. We do have some funded services, but there are paid services where companies can come in and enlist the support of the centre to be able to take things forward for them and start training their staff, and be that if they've got 4 employees or 200 employees, we'll take that and we'll help them through that. And like I said earlier on, I think had they've gone through a phishing campaign both before and after that training, they'll have understood then what risk remained in their organisation. And I often talk about that particular case that I've mentioned. It was before the NWCRC was going, and that particular case, the individual who was sort of the business owner said to me right at the very end, he said, "Chris, what can I do next?" And I had to walk away and said, "You're going to have to go on Google." So it's really good that we've got an answer to his question there of a trusted partner that he can go to, or anyone can go to be able to help them.
Yeah, it's almost like it's that ability to signpost to someone that can help you. I mean, it's we've dealt with we dealt with a pretty horrific ransomware attack at the start of last year. We were contacted late one night, and that turned into a best part of a 6-month project all in to actually get all those systems back up and restore service. And we got the customer back into something accessible within like 24 hours. But that was the very basics, and you've got to get every single system back, and that it takes a long time. And yeah, that ransomware, I don't know if you agree, I think probably the biggest thing is that immutable backup. It's that having a good set of tested backups that work reliably. Is there anything that you would add to that in terms of like backups or other things that you can do to help protect against? Obviously, you mentioned staff training. What else can you do?
Yeah, just to echo what you said around backups to start off with. So going back to that same story, the ransomware got into their backup,
right?
Unfortunately. I think you're absolutely right in what you say. It's not just around backing up and having a backup process. It's how secure is that backup from the rest of the network. And what does that look like? What's the in and out to that network look like? Because had they have had a completely separate backup, they'd have been absolutely fine through that case. It wouldn't have been a problem for them at all.
That's something that can be quite difficult to do in some organisations, but you're right, that buys you a lot of peace of mind as an organisation. If you've got that backup that is what we call like off net or immutable, and it's out of the way and no one can get to it. It's not on your domain, it's not connected, it's got different credentials that are stored, that you've got two-factor, whatever it is that protects it. That means you've got that peace of mind and can sleep easy. Okay, it would still be a pretty big disaster, but I'd have my data and we can get the business back up and running.
So when I've done training around this, I'm sure you've been the same. We often talk about sort of human versus technical controls, don't we? About the stuff that people can do and the stuff that machines will be able to do in the background. For me, obviously, we spoke around some of the human controls, haven't we? To make sure that the people in our organisations, that you trust them, that we haven't got disgruntled employees still having access to things they shouldn't have access to, because I've certainly dealt with cases like that before, where we've not changed passwords or weak passwords. And then we're probably into the more technical controls, so probably into more your area, Chris, than mine, around sort of the software around that'll help you with phishing.
Yeah, so I like to call it the human firewall. There's only so much that like technology products can do, and I get asked for like silver bullets all the time. Is there anything you can do that just cures phishing? Well, no, there's nothing I can do. I can put a tool in that'll probably clear up like 95, 97% of it, but some stuff will still get through. So we started selling a product called Avanan. It models emails that you receive to identify patterns and commonalities, and then it has a bunch of like common frameworks for like tone of voice or other things inside of emails about that a potential attacker might use. For example, like send payment immediately. These sort of things where it's like creating urgency or pressure that we tend to see in like business email compromise. Or it has also computer vision to analyze login pages. So it will take the Office 365 login page and it'll take the page that the attacker has sent you and it'll compare them with a computer and say, well, actually, the Microsoft logo is a funny color, or it doesn't say copyright 2023 at the bottom. So it's probably not the Microsoft login page. It's a high confidence. But then what we really like is, as IT people, they do instant response as a service. So end user clicks release, and we as IT people don't have to do anything. Their team check that email and say, actually, that one's good, release that, or no, actually, that one's bad for this reason, block it. And that just makes our life as IT easier, because we don't deal with, obviously we work with IT departments and they don't want to be releasing spam emails all the time from end users. And end users at 9 p.m. at night when they want an email back don't want to have to wait. And these guys work 24/7, so it makes our life a lot easier. It's not a silver bullet and stuff does get through, but it's come a long way, that technology. What interesting, I guess, dilemma is with the rise of AI technology like ChatGPT. I wonder if those attackers are going to be able to write more convincing copy in their emails. And is that going to get a lot harder to spot with technology? Probably.
Well, I think you made a really good point there, that there's going to be this ever-lasting battle, isn't there, between sophisticated attacks, sophisticated defense, and on we'll probably go with that for a long time, won't we?
That's the bit where the human training becomes even more, because if AI is able to effectively bypass the anti-phishing technology, or probably a large portion of it which relies on poor grammar, then actually what we're going to see is the human element's going to be even more important. That's where staff training will really kick in. Obviously, you mentioned, I think, earlier about passwords and why we as IT people tend to annoyingly recommend a password that tends to be like 12 characters long with like uppercase, lowercase. And it's purely because at that sort of like low character limit, what people don't understand is that actually, with this graphic here, you can see, anything up to 10 characters of numbers only is very easy to brute force near instantly. Whereas actually, you can see here that a 12 character password with numbers, uppercase and lowercase, is 2,000 years. Now, granted, technology is likely to evolve and maybe the time it takes to brute force things will become less. But if we set that 12 character password with numbercase, uppercase and lowercase, but something else we're also guilty of as IT people is we set passwords like capital TRUOW1349 star, and then no one's ever going to remember that. And one piece of interesting advice recently, which I think is really relevant to a lot of people who don't remember the passwords, is use 3, I think NCSC use 3 random words.
Absolutely.
Like light, laptop, can. And then that'll produce a password that's probably, will be enough characters to be secure. I think that was really good advice. And the thing I try to get across to people in our organization is about password reuse. About, you've got a password and you log into your Facebook with it, you log into like another website, you log into like catphotos.com. And actually what we don't want is catphotos.com gets compromised and now we've got your corporate email password and we can sign into your account. And that's where that two-factor bit. And we sometimes, you mentioned about two-factor earlier. The claim we get is that two-factor is annoying. I don't want to have to authenticate to sign into my application. But what those people don't understand, and we've done this, is, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Have I Been Pwned website.
Yeah, it's a really good one.
It's really awesome for because it helps us as IT people prove this point. Your password from catphotos.com has been compromised, and did you know it's the first 3 characters are the same one that you're using as your corporate password? So it's a really powerful mechanism to prove to business owners and individuals about why two-factor, because then that's why they need the two-factor. In terms of like passwords, what do you recommend from a sort of password or password manager perspective, and what would your tips be?
So first of all, regarding this graphic, one of the teams I've got is a digital forensics team who spend a lot of time trying to brute force their way into bad people's, be them paedophiles or organised criminals or whatever. So if you're any one of those, please disregard all this advice that's about to happen. But if you're a good person, then please pin back your ears and listen through. This is incredibly important, isn't it? This is probably the central thing. If you take nothing else away from this whole podcast, I would suggest it'd be this one, because this is probably something you can do today. It doesn't cost anything to implement either, does it? But come up with some sort of rule for your passwords. I absolutely am tally with you. I advocate that 3 random words each time. And those can be linked to something about that website or whatever. It doesn't have to be totally random, so you can actually remember what they are, because we're always balancing that accessibility, aren't we, versus security, and there's got to be that balance between those two things.
Yep.
That two-factor authentication that sits on top of that just keeps all those bad people out, doesn't it?
Yep.
I'm entirely with you on that. And just one word of caution regarding passwords, that we'll often think of things that are probably linked to ourselves, won't we? So we'll often go, okay, well, I like cricket and I like beer and I like, I don't know, gambling. So they're going to be my 3 random words. They might be random for most people, but then if we happen to go onto your Facebook or your Instagram
the quizzes. Yeah, I thought we might touch on this.
Or whatever it might be, you can soon find out things about people, can't you? About what their dog's called, their cat's called, or partner, or whatever else it might be, their child, and the year they were born. Again, I'm harking back a couple of years here, but I used to do a similar presentation where I'd try and guess people's passwords, and there's a couple of people, when I started talking about, is it their grandchild, their son, daughter, or whatever, and their year of birth, they'd quickly been scribbling down or quickly going into their phone to try and change things, because you're absolutely right that sort of accessibility, that memorability of that password is so important to us. We've got to be able to access it, haven't we, to use that password. Yep. So those 3 random words that have got to have some anchoring, but then with that caveat of, well, what you talk about on your social media, what you externalize and what you put to the world, what you publish about yourself, we don't want to link those 2 things together.
Yeah, I saw a graphic recently, and it was those daft Facebook questionnaires, and it was they were reviewing them to see actually the people's answers to those, and then looking at their online banking questions and say, well, actually, chances are that within those questionnaires that you completed, your online banking password for like, what school did you go to? What's your favourite colour? All that sort of stuff is probably in those questionnaires. And it's a documentary I watched recently, and it was saying that if something's free, that you are the product. And this, that disappears off sort of down a different rabbit hole completely around social media and the retention of end user data and stuff. And you just don't know what's like you've got the whole Cambridge Analytica thing that happened. And there's a lot of data inside social media that's very, very powerful around consumer behaviour. Like, for example, and I'm not sure whether there's any truth in it, but the Facetune type stuff that you see take place, well, actually, a lot of those companies have been, they're offshore, and actually, well, what are they doing with that data? We don't know, but it's probably not good things. It comes back to like being careful around what you share online and what your privacy settings are set to, and kind of what people can glean from your social accounts that might impact your corporate work. And one of them is being, sharing things that might help people guess your password or guess your recovery options. I mean, I've not really seen much of that, but I've seen some pretty clever stuff at the larger scale of businesses, and that's where that sort of stuff becomes really relevant, particularly around like new starters being caught out and getting emails from someone that isn't internal. There's lots of technical stuff you can do to help with that. But yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to the training.
I think it all does, doesn't it? And I think, let's be dead honest, we're in that information age, aren't we? And what we publish about ourselves is a window into us, isn't it? You look at anybody's social media who's in this room with us, we'll get to understand a lot about that person. I'm sure most organisations, now mine certainly does, goes onto Facebook and social media and does all these things, all these checks to understand, well, what do you actually talk about and who do you associate with and what goes on in your life. And I'm sure many other organisations do the same. And I suppose that sort of echoes that sort of caution really around what we publish is probably going to be with us for a bit of time.
Yeah, almost forever probably. Yeah, and the proliferation of data just goes on and on and on, and you don't know where that goes. The thing we spoke about before, it's the NCSC security survey. What they were trying to do is compare a segment of businesses and a segment of charities, and they were showing the two side by side. And it was interesting that the side of it was that charities basically don't take security as probably as, and I've seen this, they probably don't take it as much of a priority as they should do, because they still store a lot of sensitive data. But the perception is, we're a charity, why would anyone ever want to hack into us? Why would they want to compromise our email? And what would you say to businesses that, perhaps are smaller or are charities that say, well, actually, why would anyone want to come after us? What could they possibly do?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I think, unfortunately, this area of business knows no bounds, does it? And, there's a lot of charities, for example, doing some really, really good work and really helping their communities and beyond. And unfortunately, they've equally been victims of cases, as have other types of those sorts of small businesses that do some real good stuff. And all those things for businesses are really difficult to get across, aren't they? Because if you're a charity, you want to spend all your charitable donations on pushing forward the business of your charity, don't you? And I think it almost goes back to what we were speaking about earlier on, perhaps, around saying, well, actually, you need to keep all that information safe, because I don't know, we've not really spoke about it today so far, have we? But the Information Commissioner's Office are of quite robust, and rightly so, because our information is important to us all, isn't it? To make sure that we keep all that information safe. And charities are under equally the duty to keep all that information safe as the rest of us, probably a little bit more morally, because of the values that they have. So certainly for the Northwest CRC, we've been focusing some of our efforts around charities, and we've been trying to make sure that we can deliver service for charities at the minimal cost, because obviously we want to support them. We're an ethical seller, but we want to make sure that we can build in some support for them.
Yeah, because there's a lot of data, and there's a duty of care to protect that, whether it's trustees or donations or sensitive stuff that might have been shared during consultation with what charities refer to as their clients. You've got as the IT department there, you've got a duty of care to make sure that all stays safe and secure. And that ransomware is not just let's go and encrypt your data. Sometimes it's let's encrypt your data, let's exfiltrate your data to Tor, and then let's DDoS your website so that you can't operate as a business anymore. And while in the B2B space, there's some that don't suffer with that. If you're doing a lot of e-com, that is crippling for your organization. And if your charity relies on online services, it could be crippling as well.
Yeah, definitely. We touched on DDoS there, didn't we?
We did,
within that, and we've not really sort of ventured down that road, have we yet? So I've got a little bit of a story regarding DDoS, and hopefully it'll put things into context for other organisations as well. So I dealt with a DDoS on policing, and this particular individual had DDoSed both Cheshire and Greater Manchester Police's website, so it took the services offline. So what that meant was individuals who wanted to report crime online couldn't. They couldn't contact the officers they wanted to contact, and various other services. They couldn't access the advice or whatever else. So basically denying the good people of Cheshire at the time the right to use their police force's website. So managed to do a load of investigation around it and found a particular individual who posted on Twitter that they, not necessarily saying that they've done it, but sort of suggesting that they had a lot of knowledge about this DDoS. And long story short, we went round to that person's address. They were running something called Kali Linux in the background, which for those techie who are listening in, that's quite an aggressive operating system, isn't it, that you tend to use for hacking? Is that quite right, Chris? Would you say?
Yeah, so it's used by a lot of pen testers for validating like vulnerability scanning or carrying out testing in a sort of a defensive manner. But yes, it can be used for an offensive purpose too. I'm curious because we've been on the receiving end of phone calls about because we're an ISP as well. We sometimes get phone calls from the police around, can you tell us you access such and such a system at such a time? Well, often it's public Wi-Fi where we're just the ISP and we have no control over the access. So if someone is committing a crime and you've identified an IP address, do you go to the ISP? Do you have to get like some sort of approval? Like, probably not a warrant, I guess, but like what does the process look like?
Yeah, so to be able to access someone's IP address, it's quite personal information, isn't it? So it's protected by what we call RIPA. So it used to be called the Regulatory Investigatory Powers Act. It's now been shortened down. They got rid of the R, and the legislation's changed slightly to modernise up to times. But essentially, it's regulated again by the Information Commissioner to make sure that what the police ask for, what law enforcement asks for, is proportionate.
Yep.
And make sure it's necessary to be able to get that information. So it's got to relate to a certain case. It can't be sort of, I know we spoke about phishing, but I mean phishing with an F this time. It can't be phishing around what Chris is doing or anything like that. It's got to be quite specific, and it's got to be the least intrusive manner to be able to get that information. So what we would get back from the ISP is that, right, okay, well, Chris Maddocks was signed up for that IP during that time period, or it's a VPN or whatever else it might be, and you're probably going to ask, what can you do with VPNs? There are ways around VPNs, and law enforcement can deliver that. So that's not a problem. We can do VPNs. So that's what we do around ISPs.
Cool. It's just interesting because we get the occasion, not very often anymore because we don't do as much public Wi-Fi as we used to for customers. But it was just curious. So we got a question come through. So if I'm connected to public Wi-Fi and I'm perhaps processing a payment online, is my data secure?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Probably really relevant to a lot of people listening as well. So my advice when you use public Wi-Fi will always be to use a VPN, because what that ultimately does is it will create some encryption, so creates it secret between you and sort of the other end. Because what you don't want to happen during that sort of Wi-Fi period is for people to see what's going across that Wi-Fi, that public part of the Wi-Fi between your device and the internet on the other end. So I would always use a VPN if I was doing anything around any shopping, any banking, anything important like that. I would always do that. If it's something just like browsing the website, the internet for a website or whatever for something uncontentious, then it doesn't really matter. But my advice would always be, if you're using a logon, if you're ever accessing passwords, banking, all that sort of thing, use a VPN.
Cool.
Or don't use Wi-Fi.
Yeah. I thought I'd get into the nerdy bit as to why that is. So when you join public Wi-Fi, we can do SSL inspection and interception, and we do this in an IT context, in that when you're on the corporate network, we want to protect your searches that you're making and make sure that you're using a legitimate Google website. And if it's all HTTPS and we can't see it as IT, we can't control what you can search from, what you can browse. So we do an element of SSL interception or SSL inspection, and effectively that's what a lot of these hotspots do. And that's why, to sort of speak to the question, is that That's why if you go on those public Wi-Fi and they're able to change the SSL certificate and intercept it, that they can see your actual raw underlying data, and they could ultimately end up taking card details or banking details.
Just sticking with Wi-Fi for a bit, we've spent a bit of time looking at how people can protect themselves, haven't we? At home with their passwords. We've spoke about 2FA. We've spoken about loads of different things, and I suppose I'm sure many people watching will have gone onto public Wi-Fi. Be that you go to a hotel and you sign in, putting in some very brief details, or you are in a coffee shop and you use their public Wi-Fi. I've got some good people working for me that can do some technical things, and I'm probably not one of those people. However, I purchased a particular device off the internet that could emulate, that portal that you can log on to if you go to a hotel and it says put your details in and all the rest of it, that could emulate that. And even I could work that, and I'm not a sophisticated hacker and all the rest of it. I managed to do a bit of a show and tell once where we put this portal on and watch people sign up to it, and then we put all the details in that people put on, and sometimes they were the passwords they had for their email accounts, sometimes they were the email accounts and passwords together. So we're thinking about sort of that data exfiltration, how it all works and those sorts of things. And I suppose my message is, if I can do it, and then I'm sure other people can as well.
It's interesting. I've not thought about that as an attack vector. Because you do see people saying, well, actually, if you be careful what you put on these sort of like hotspots, and actually consider the use of a VPN, and particularly like when you're talking about corporate VPN, like actually connect your corporate VPN, because if you're in a cafe, you don't know that someone's not monitoring that traffic. We just don't know. I've never bought one.
Yeah,
but we have like thought about getting stuff to like demo to people to show them, because I heard about one of our customers got demoed by a security provider. They carried out an exploit on something in their, I think it was like the Bluetooth dongle of their Logitech keyboard had a vulnerability. Yeah. I think he said he was sat in the car park.
Yeah.
And they'd done it on one keyboard and said, right, you go and type something in. And he was sat in the car park reading what they'd typed into the keyboard.
Wow.
From, I'm assuming it's probably like 30 to 50 meters away.
Yeah.
I'm sure that depends how good your signal is. But it just shows like the ability, like, because that's the next day is like getting physical access, planting a device inside the corporate network, and that is a rabbit hole.
But that's a bit deep for that one.
Yeah, when you start dealing with like credit card payments and PCI DSS, then that sort of stuff does become important. But I think that's probably 800 plus user type deployments before we start having that problem, I think. But again, we'll have to go and check about the legality of this device, because I don't actually know that much about it, but I've seen it in the US. And it's the ability to record RF signals and replay. So people were using it to clone HID, MyFair cards for access card readers. And that stuff is probably very difficult to defend against. And then we start getting probably into physical access and how do you do two-factor on that? Probably, I'm sure someone has done two-factor. Well, they do, of course, biometric and PIN codes.
Yeah.
There's lots of cool tech, and this is the kind of tech that is out there, and employees could bring this into disgruntled employees could bring this into the business. Disgruntled employees are extremely hard to spot. So how do you identify and deal with a potential internal threat, like a disgruntled employee?
Unfortunately, we've seen cases of this around the Northwest, where a disgruntled employee would either be sacked or know they were going to be leaving, or whatever it might be, and do something to a network, or still have the passwords and the username access once they've left the organisation. So I suppose for me, this goes back to that sort of cyber hygiene, that making sure that our user credentials are appropriate. So take the second part of the example to start off with. So once I've left the organisation, it's really important to make sure that all my access is disabled, and certainly any sort of remote access or anything like that, because the case that I'm particularly thinking of here, an individual managed to do quite a lot of damage. I think it was up to about £100,000 worth of damage to this organisation. I'm just being a bit careful what I say, so I don't sort of reveal the organisation. Yeah. But about £100,000 worth of damage to this organisation, unfortunately, and it was only that was the whole part of it, really, that he just didn't have his credentials taken off him. I think actually with that guy, I'm not sure if it was his credentials. Actually, I think he had access to some admin, and the admin was sort of a used account by a couple of different people, which made it even more difficult. Because then you're looking at, well, where did that access come from? Yeah,
that's the issue with shared accounts. I think it's the password rotation on shared accounts and how you control them and protect them. And we've the steps we've taken to control this, because we have a nightmare with it because we've got a lot of different systems and we have a very boring spreadsheet. Whenever someone leaves, we have a list of all the applications they use and we go through. And the annoying thing is, a lot of applications these days don't let you have this thing called SAML. So SAML is, we connect it to our Active Directory system with all our users in. And when someone leaves and we disable them, they get disabled in that system automatically. And a lot of applications that we buy, they say, well, that's the enterprise plan. You don't get that anyway. And I think that should come as standard because it's a massive security bonus. And what that means is we end up in a scenario where at the end, when someone leaves, it's extremely manual to go and remove them. But yeah, we just have a list of all the systems and we just go through and manually remove them. And it is the only way to have good hygiene on those types of accounts. Because you're right, because that shared account is going to need the password rotating when someone leaves. And it's tedious but important that you do that.
But I suppose as well with your shared accounts, what you don't get is a track of what someone does on that shared account either. Take a law enforcement point of view. No circumstance on this earth there'd be shared accounts. Because it's really important that you all know as the public what access that Chris Maddocks has had, so you can see that what Chris is looking at. And I suppose it's going to be difficult for some businesses, isn't it? I'm just thinking about the people that might be watching now, whether they might only have a couple of user accounts, and they might need to rotate some of those. And I suppose, and that's probably the balance, isn't it, for some businesses around, well, what's the risk of that? And I suppose if people understand the risk, they know exactly what risk they're going into. They might not have the ability to mitigate that risk by having different user accounts for different people because it might be an affordability issue or the way the system works or whatever it might be.
Yeah, sometimes one control we've seen on using individual accounts becomes too cumbersome. Some systems you can restrict them by IP address, which is a good halfway house. At least if it's a leaver who can't be on that same IP address, you can protect them that way. So one thing we need to talk about is DDoS. So can you tell me what DDoS is?
Yes, DDoS is almost for a computer having a really bad day where everyone's having a bit of a go at you. So you get home, the dog's barking at you, the children are having a go at you, your partner's saying something awful to you and your head explodes and says, I can't do this anymore. So from a computer analogy...
I like this. I like this analogy.
In a computer analogy, it's having several requests all at the same time and it going, oh, I can't cope with this. This is far too much. So the example that I talk about is around when Greater Manchester Police and Cheshire Police both had their websites attacked. Really interesting case.
One interesting thing that came up actually from what we've been doing with our managed SOC is that we get to know when people go on holiday because we get an alert to say that they've travelled from one country to another. And we know that they're logging in from, say, Spain or America because they don't normally, and it flags up in our system. So we know when you go on holiday. So if someone was committing cybercrime, what laws does that actually relate to?
It might shock you actually, Chris, when I start talking about this, especially the year in which the legislation was made. So I'm going to talk about the Computer Misuse Act of, do you want to guess the year? You might even know.
Is it 1979?
Not too far. 1990.
But you should know that.
So there's a couple of offences that people can commit by doing cybercrime, if you like. And I'll just whiz through them because I'm certainly not an encyclopedia and I'm sure people can Google them at their leisure. But essentially, Section 1 of the Act basically says if you log on to something that you shouldn't, you commit an offence. And it's as plain as that. So those that will use someone else's Hotmail account or Facebook account, log into that without permission, those sorts of things, they commit offences. And that's the law to try and protect people from hacking, essentially. So it's the hacking offence. Section 2 starts then talking about if you log into something when you shouldn't and you do things within that, then you commit a more serious offence. So you might log into my user account and you might delete things. I'd be a bit annoyed, especially if my backup wouldn't be very good, Chris. But
especially if it was the cat photos.
Cat photos, yeah. Obviously our backups are really good now, Chris, aren't we? Because we've spoken about backups. Yeah. And then finally, section 3 is more around your sort of ransomwares, basically doing things to machines that break them, essentially. So you might DDoS or ransomware them and stop people from having access to them in a different way. So the law, it covers most of the things that happen. I can't think through that of anything that we've spoken around that sort of doesn't cover. And I suppose that collection of data is probably an issue as well, isn't it?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just listening to what you were saying and writing it down. And like 1990, a lot's changed. But actually, when I sat back and thought about what you just said, it's all still relevant. So it's amazing actually something like a law that was designed in the 1990s is still applicable, even though technology has changed. Because back in 1990, like we didn't have phones. In fact, we don't think we even, well, maybe we did, but it was more like pages and you had to ring somebody back.
Those are the days.
Yeah.
No, you're right. But I suppose the key mechanisms behind them are the same, aren't they? So the technology has moved on, but we still log into things, we still use things, we still can delete things from them, and we can still mess machines up and all the rest of it. There's also legislation from the Fraud Act, which was made in 2006, and that looks at articles that you might have that could be used to commit fraud. So you might have something that makes fake credit cards, for instance, or from a cyber world, something that you might use in hacking, those sorts of things with a view to using it in fraud. So there's legislation that sort of prevents fraud and cybercrime as well, which is really, really useful for us.
That's interesting. And in terms of the sentencing for these types of crimes, what does it typically look like? So if someone committed let's say it was like a typical fraud case where someone has gained access to, like a disgruntled employee's gained access to a system they shouldn't have done. They've transferred some money or deleted some data. What's the typical sort of sentencing like for someone who carries out a crime like that?
A typical sentence for the story I gave around the individual DDoS the police, he got 6 months in prison at Crown Court. I think it's fair to say that for most offences, we've got some really clear sentencing guidelines. For these types of offences, because of the lower numbers that come through criminal justice outcomes, there's probably not the maturity of the sentencing guidelines. Right. So it's not quite as clear and robust as if you smack somebody in the street. Yeah, because we're very clear on what that looks like. And that being said, it's not all about criminal justice outcomes for me with this. It's not all about just putting somebody in front of the court. Yeah. It's around disrupting their activity. So it might be if somebody's doing an offence but coming in from a different country, we might just be able to close that route in. Yeah. It might be that we take down a website. It might be that we do something else to stop that activity and do that quickly, robustly, and move on to the next, because like we said right at the very start of this, there's so much of this crime. We've got to put our resource where it can be best used, and that's to make sure that we can keep people as safe as possible. Yeah, I mean, we raced over it there very quickly, but actually that's a really important part of malware and ransomware. So we go back to the attack on the NHS, and the name escapes me, the particular piece of ransomware that... WannaCry, yeah. There was someone decrypted it or unpacked it and was able to find that actually there was this URL, and actually they could go and I think they either bought the domain or they did something with it, or someone was able to take it down, and then it couldn't activate anymore, and that was it. They stopped in its tracks. It was very quickly, but actually that's a huge component of reducing the effects of cybercrime. No, it is. You're absolutely right. And those sort of alternatives, and for me this is why this is so important, because I could put some communications out to people on a daily basis, which we do, If you looked at the Northwest ROCU website today, I'm sure there'll be some sort of message around counter fraud or countering cybercrime in some respect, but we've got to think about some different angles we can do with this. So thanks for inviting us to this, Chris. I think it's been really, really good.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for coming.
I think I've closed there, haven't I?
You have. It's gone for the close.
Very good, that's very good.
Thanks for joining today's Gone Phishing webinar with the two Chris's. I hope today's been really beneficial and informative for you, learning about phishing, different type of attack vectors, some of Chris's really interesting stories. And if you'd like to be protected against cyber threats, then check out our website and have a look at our managed SOC products, which will help give you peace of mind 24/7. And now I'll pass over to our guest, DCI Chris Maddocks, to wrap up.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting us for this. I think it's been really beneficial. It's really, really difficult to get these messages across, isn't it? And I think hopefully it's been useful, and we've got the messages across okay. I suppose from my point of view, my sort of parting things really are around, well, let's have a conversation about how law enforcement can support. We've got the Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre that can support with training. We've understood that the people in our organisations are probably our weakest link, and that's probably the quickest way to be able to deal with some of those big issues that we probably need to address sooner rather than later. We can spend a lot of money on technical controls, but some of the quickest things we can do is start to have a look at our people. So the Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre can support that.
The power of the human firewall. I feel like that's basically what this is summarised. It is the power of the human firewall. It's that no matter what you do, what technology you deploy, the team that you have in your organisation is your biggest asset, not only to your business, but to your cyber defence.